Turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Ruth. Ruth, not Chrissy Ruth, just Ruth. It's hard to find in between Judges and 1 Samuel. It's a little small, wonderful book. We're currently in a preaching series about facing the struggles of life. And this week we're looking at something that we Americans have never faced, at least not to this degree. But we're beginning to get some hints of what it might be like. And the subject is when the grocery store shelves are empty. In our lifetimes, we've not experienced a real shortage of food. Now, over the past 2 years during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have experienced some empty shelves. Primarily toilet paper, at one point beans and pasta. For a very short time, meat was limited. And now it seems like every time we make out a grocery list and go to the grocery store, there'll be at least an item or two or three on our list that they're out of. Sometimes you folks that are the cooks may feel like you're on the TV show Chopped. You've just got what you've got. What are you going to do with it? Because the grocery store was out of what you wanted. And isn't it interesting that many items we often buy are out of stock, but the shelves of Valentine candy are completely full? Now look at this picture of harvested wheat, with the silos behind already full. You know, that's a lot of potential bread and pasta, cookies or brownies, and wheat fields across the country keep producing every year. So I'm thinking, how could a real shortage of food ever hit American grocery shelves? And one of the possible events that could trigger massive grocery store shelves in our day being empty might be a huge solar flare that would wipe out the electrical grid and all electric components in motors and computers. So on the farms, tractors wouldn't work, combines wouldn't work, trucks wouldn't work to carry the grain to the factories to produce the food, and the factories would be out of commission because the machines run on electricity. Delivery trucks would be out of commission and couldn't deliver to the grocery stores, and grocery stores would have no electricity to run lights and refrigerators and cash registers. Is something like that possible? Maybe. Is it likely? No. But you never know. We've never experienced a severe famine during our lifetime that has left grocery stores totally, completely empty. But over the course of history, the Israelites did several times. A severe famine at that time in history was usually caused by a change in weather patterns that resulted in no rain for 7 years. You'll remember that kind of thing happened in Egypt during the time of Joseph. For 7 years, there was no rain and no crops were produced. But because God had led Joseph to Egypt and brought him to power in the Egyptian government, Joseph had stockpiled enough grain during the previous 7 years, not only to keep Egypt alive, but also many people groups who lived in surrounding nations, like Joseph's family who lived in Canaan. So now our passage today in the book of Ruth, many generations later, when the judges ruled in Israel, it happened again. So the question we're going to look at this morning is, what does a follower of God do when there is a real famine? We're going to look at the story of Naomi, the wife of Elimelech, and the mother-in-law of Ruth. Now, usually when a preacher preaches from the book of Ruth, the subject is about Ruth. But our subject for today, the main character, is Naomi. Read with me, please, in Ruth chapter 1, starting with verse 1. Dennis, I got a ring in my ears up here. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Did you notice where they were from? Bethlehem. Keep that underlined in your mind. We're going to need it later. We don't know what the situation was that enabled there to be food in Moab, east of the Dead Sea, in what is now part of the nation of Jordan. And just a few miles away, well, it was many miles away, but across the Dead Sea and a little further north, in the land of Judah, there was a severe famine that lasted many years. We don't know how there happened to be food in Moab, but Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons left Bethlehem and traveled east and then south into the country of Moab. And verse 2 says they settled there. One possible answer to the question, what should we do when grocery stores are empty, could be to move to where there is food. I'm guessing that the U-Haul camel rental business was booming during that famine. You know, in the 1930s, many of the farmers who lived in the Midwest Dust Bowl moved to other places. Some, like my grandfather, developed irrigation and leveled their fields and began irrigating after that Dust Bowl was over. But why move to Moab? Well, there was a very ancient connection between Israel and Moab. The Moabites traced their lineage, their history, back to Lot, Abraham's nephew, and the story of their history starts in Genesis 19 after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed and Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt. Hundreds of years later, as the nation of Israel went from Egypt to the Promised Land, they avoided going through Moab because by that time Moab and Israel had become enemies. Why move to Moab, Elimelech and Naomi? I have no idea other than there happened to be food in Moab. And then why was this Israelite family accepted in that community? Why did they settle down there? I have no idea. Often there's more than one struggle going on at any given time. Probably true for you folks too. More than one struggle going on at any given time. That was true of this Israelite family who had immigrated to Moab. We don't know how much time had elapsed between verse 2 and verse 3. It may have been soon after arriving Moab, or it may have been as much as a few years later. Ruth 1 verse 3. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. Don't know how much time passed between verse 3 and 4. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah. Get that pronounced right. It's not Oprah. It's Orpah. And the other, a woman named Ruth. So how did Elimelech die? The dad. Was it an accident at work? Was it a disease like the Spanish flu that raced through Moab? Had this Israelite family been oppressed as foreigners and somehow Elimelech was bullied and killed? We don't know how he died. The Bible just says he died. In those days when the man of the house died, it was a catastrophe because the livelihood of the family usually died with him. It was a good thing that Naomi had 2 sons who by this time were old enough to keep the family provided for. We don't know what kind of business the family was in, but the young men were able to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. An added blessing was that without a husband and as a foreigner, somehow Naomi was able to negotiate with the local community and the local matchmaker to get wives for her sons. This in itself is possibly a miracle, seeing that they were foreigners and served different gods. Guys, how would you like for your mom and some old cranky lady in the community to pick a wife for you? Ladies, how would you like to be subject to that choice? No, I kind of like our American way of picking spouses. Ruth chapter 1, verse 4. About 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband. You know, this was piling disaster upon disaster upon disaster. First, a famine which caused grocery store shelves to be empty, pushed the family into moving far away from the place where all of their people had lived to go to a foreign country where there was food. Then the man of the house, Elimelech, died. It was disaster upon disaster. The good news, often disasters are mixed with a little good news. We don't know how long it was after Elimelech's death, but there were 2 weddings, one for each of Naomi's sons. There is no record of either of their sons having children yet, so they probably hadn't been married for long. And then both sons died. Disaster upon disaster upon disaster. And Naomi lost all hope of providing for herself, plus now her 2 sons' wives were her responsibility too. What's a person to do? Verse 6. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. Grocery store shelves were full again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab and return to her homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place they had been living, and they took the road that would lead back to Judah. So Naomi decided to go back to where her extended family was. You know, that's a good plan. If it had been you, where would you go back to? Where are your people at? I almost want to ask for a show of hands for some of these places, but no, don't do that. Just listen for yours. You might go back to California, or your people may still be in Ohio, or in the state of Washington, or Illinois, or Michigan, or Mexico, or El Salvador, or Germany, or Prescott, or Tucson. For Naomi, she decided to move back to, where were her people from? Bethlehem in Judah. As they began their trip, Naomi began thinking through what they might find when they arrived in Bethlehem. And the question still nagging her was, how in the world would she provide for her widowed daughters-in-law? Well, the common path for a widow in those days was levirate marriage, and I'm glad it doesn't exist today. You see, a brother of her deceased husband would marry her. This was still common many generations later in Jesus' time, because in Mark chapter 12 we read, then Jesus was approached by some Sadducees, religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. They posed this question to Jesus. Teacher, Moses gave us a law that if a man dies leaving a wife without children, his brother should marry the widow and have a child who will carry on the brother's name. Well, suppose there were 7 brothers. The oldest one married and died without children. So the second brother married the widow, but he also died without children. Then the third brother married her. This continued with all 7 of them, and still there were no children. If I was kid number 8, there ain't no way I would fulfill that law. Last of all, the woman died. So the Sadducees said, "So tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her." Jesus replied, "Your mistake is that you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and in this respect they will be like the angels in heaven." Jesus is saying we won't be married in heaven. We'll be like the angels. Maybe even gender neutral. Who knows? I haven't been there. I can't tell you yet. But here's what Naomi decided to do in chapter 1, verse 8. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and for them to refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. You see, Orpah understood the reasoning and felt it was in her best interest to do what her mother-in-law had suggested. And she went back to her parents' home. But Ruth didn't like the plan. Verse 14. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever I die, wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. After that interaction, I have this question. Was Ruth the problem child, or was she a blessing? I'm guessing that Naomi was not sure at that moment. Why did Ruth want to stay with Naomi instead of returning to her biological family? Well, you folks know how my imagination works, so I've come up with some possible scenarios. What if Ruth's home life, what had her home life been like before she had married Naomi's son? Had it been difficult and maybe even abusive, and that's why she didn't want to return to her parents' home? I don't know. What was the relationship between Naomi and Ruth like? Had they become really, really good friends since Ruth's marriage to Naomi's son, and she didn't want to leave the best friend she had ever had? Can a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law be that close? Here's one that's very possible. Had Ruth genuinely converted to Naomi's God? Was returning to the worship of Moabite idols simply not an option for her because of her relationship with the one true God that she had discovered through Naomi and Naomi's family? Don't know. Could be. Whatever the reason, Ruth pledged her loyalty to Naomi. Now in our days, verses 16 and 17 are sometimes used in wedding ceremonies, demonstrating the commitment of the couple to each other. You know how it goes. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And wherever you die, I will die there and be buried. And may the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. What most people don't realize is that that statement was not originally used in a wedding ceremony, but by a widowed daughter-in-law to her widowed mother-in-law. Ruth must have had a great sense of respect for her mother-in-law. Verse 19, so the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. Is it really Naomi? The women asked. Oh, don't call me Naomi, she responded. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has made my life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? So Naomi's attitude on arriving back in Bethlehem was bitter. Life had dealt her some significant struggles. First, a famine had forced her and a family away from the only home she had ever known. Then her husband died. Then both of her sons died. No wonder she was bitter, probably depressed, definitely angry, and blaming God for all the bitter struggles and tragedies she had experienced. But at least she was back home with her people, her relatives, and lifelong friends. So what can we do when we've experienced tragedy after tragedy after tragedy? Well, I'm reminded of the Hollywood movie called Hook, Captain Hook. Peter Banning's son, Jack, was being manipulated by Captain Hook into disowning his father. The pirates had set up a baseball game for Jack to be the hero of. And as Jack came up to bat, the cheerleaders got the cheer wrong. Instead of cheering out, "Home run, Jack!" Instead, they shouted out, "Run home, Jack! Run home, Jack!" And that's what Naomi did. She ran home where she would be surrounded by her relatives and her lifelong friends. Now, in our generation, that's not always an option. For me personally, there's no family to run home to. My relatives are scattered all over the country. My mom's family came from Kansas, but they aren't there anymore. My dad's family came from Colorado, and only one small part of the family is still there. So for me, where is home? Wherever I happen to be at the time. And I think that's one reason why friends and a church family are so important in our culture. Proverbs chapter 27, verse 10 says, "Never abandon a friend, either yours or your father's. When disaster strikes, you won't have to ask your brother for assistance. It's better to go to a neighbor than to a brother who lives far away." Ruth chapter 1, verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. They were home, but there was still the issue of how these two widow women were going to provide for themselves. And since it was barley harvest time, Ruth offered to glean after the harvesters in the barley fields. Now, this was a very common practice for the Israelite people. In the Old Testament law, in Leviticus 23, verse 22, the law says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. And that's what Ruth decided to do. Chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out to enter a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she just happened to be working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Boaz noticed Ruth in the field and began to get to know her. Chapter 2, verse 11. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you have left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz was very kind to Ruth and to Naomi during those weeks of the harvest season. But Naomi had bigger plans for Ruth and Boaz. Chapter 3, verse 1. One day Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours, and tonight he'll be winnowing the barley on the threshing floor. So wash, in other words, take a bath, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes, then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lay down, and he will tell you what to do. You see, Naomi was an expert in how to trap a husband. And it worked. Boaz volunteered to jump through the hoops necessary within the Israelite levirate marriage system so that he could marry Ruth. Chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, praise be the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. Now over in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, in the middle of that genealogy we read Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And where did David live? Luke chapter 2, in those days Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. And he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger. I've never thought of it this way before, but I want to respond this morning by saying, thank you, Naomi. You helped make this happen. If it hadn't have been for a famine that took Naomi to Moab and tragedies of her husband and sons passing away, and looking for how she was going to provide for herself and her daughters-in-law, she ends up back in Bethlehem and becomes a distant relative of Jesus, our Savior. Here's my conclusion. Jan, I think I just skipped a slide or two. Here's my conclusion. When grocery stores are empty, trust God and follow his leading. And when disasters pile on top of disasters, keep trusting God and keep following his leading. Like he did with Naomi, God knows what's going on in your life, and he will make a way for you even if you go through the valley of the shadow of death. He will lead you to a good place where you'll be provided for, and your life's going to have value and will continue for many, many generations to come. When the grocery stores are empty, when husband and sons die, and you don't know what you're going to do, we don't have to be afraid, because we have God with us who's going to help us and help us make a new life. Let's sing about that.
Trust the power of your word.
his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen. You are dismissed.